Hello everyone, greetings. My name is Bill. Thanks so much for coming. I hope lunch was delicious. We're here today to talk about context. How many of you have ever traveled to Africa? Okay, a few folks. So if you've traveled to Africa, you know that when you're in Africa, your context is fundamentally different than when you're in America, yeah? Different rules of communication, different cultural norms, different religions, sometimes different languages. The whole context is different. So if you're trying to conduct business, if you're trying to get married, you need to know how to participate in the local context to be effective, right? To get out of it what you're expecting. That will be a common theme today. What am I expecting? What are the results that I'm expecting from this context? Has anyone traveled to, let's think of a very small country in East Africa here. Has anyone ever traveled to Rwanda in East Africa? We have, oh my goodness. Two folks have, and did you say you've traveled to Rwanda as well, up front here? Okay, well at least two folks have traveled to Rwanda as well. So you could say, great, based on their history and that people group that's there, their context is even different than the entire continent of Africa, right? It's localized, it's a different language even, a very different history, a different present day. If you pass the border and go over into Congo, up into Uganda, down into Burundi, over into Tanzania, over into Kenya, you're going to feel a major league shift in the context of the culture relative to the rest of Africa. So that's not only just kind of a hook and a primer and a little analogy, that's also a bit of my story as well. I'm a husband and father of three. We live now back in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up. But we really raised our kids in Rwanda, in East Africa. And our session won't really be about this, but I did just want to give you a little bit of background to kind of who I am, what's my context for context. Originally, it was almost 5-6 years ago that my wife was a litigator in Chicago, and she kind of got a little bit burnt out of that lifestyle and ultimately sent an application off to an organization called International Justice Mission. And she was granted a human rights fellowship working on some of the most important challenges and some also just the heaviest, most challenging work. And it was just amazing. It was like 3 months into our time in Rwanda that I met an American guy who happened to be working with and running this large coffee exporter. And they were using, of all things, everybody now, FileMaker. Isn't that crazy? What a small world. They were using FileMaker. And what a perfect tool for the job, right? Power goes out, FileMaker's good, right? Like, it's awesome. These offline apps that they were trying to do some cool things out in the field to collect data for these microloans. But they didn't quite have the full kind of in-house capacity to measure really difficult things like their hedging inventory position and modeling profit and selling coffee off to places like Starbucks. So they kind of brought me in right then, and that's how we launched Keys' Solutions. We started teaching FileMaker, and I was just so grateful at that moment that we started teaching FileMaker in Rwanda. That 13 years before that, also this another amazing moment in my life, I had met Bob Bowers from Soliant Consulting. Bob and I were singing in a choir together in Chicago, and afterwards I said, hey, do you have any interns? And I became the first intern that Bob ever brought on at Chris Moyer Consulting, which was then the Moyer Group, which ultimately became Soliant Consulting. So my journey was through Soliant until about 5 or 6 years ago when we moved to Rwanda. Part of what I'd love to relay today is some of the things that I discovered in those 5 years since I've started teaching context and teaching FileMaker in Africa. So I'm excited to get down to the content. We'll overlay the context for context today. Then I'd like to walk us through 3 analogies. I'm hopeful that these analogies will stick with you for a long time. As you're in the throes of developing some complicated calculation or trying to set up a layout in a few weeks, I'd love for these analogies, if nothing else, to stick in your brain. We'll also walk through just some very specific techniques and some demos. I want you to be able to explore and to create kind of your own ways. At the same time, I also want to just say, hey, these are some tips and tools that have worked for me and that have worked for others that I've interacted with. And lastly, we'll kind of wrap that up with a couple of extra little techniques that we've worked with at Soliant and that we've also worked with at Kiza. So let's just start with the context for context here. Here's a kind of a big definition from Webster.com. You already have an impression of what context is in your mind. That's a good thing. We want to draw on that. What does this word mean to you? Webster says it's the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs. It's the environment. It's the setting. In systems, we think of it as it's like the limiting factor, right? Context tells us as much about where we are and what we can do as it does about where we are not and what we can't do, right? If we go back to the Rwanda analogy, there are certain things that you just simply cannot do as an expat in a foreign country, right? It won't work. It won't get the expected result. You have to adjust your expectations to that localized context. And the same thing's going to be true inside of FileMaker. I think the analogy holds. It's also a key to how any database is going to operate, right? Without context, if you just say, hey, database, spit me back some stuff, and some of it's from over there, some of it's from over there. The whole idea, of course, of a relational database is that we're going to move data efficiently. And so we have to supply our systems with a baseline context. We have to say, this is where we're starting from, this is my framework, this is my perspective. That's a key not only to operational efficiency with how that database is going to feed stuff back to us, but it's also, very critically, it's a key to your development efficiency. If you can grasp context, you can write code really quickly because you're going to know where you are. Just before our session, we were speaking about, with some of you, and speaking about, geez, I'm in a script, and I'm not quite sure. I've got a found set. I've got a couple of windows open. Like, what's my context? And I know I have been wrestling with those things too, and I've felt those moments when you're just not quite sure why something's not working. A lot of times the answer is context. In FileMaker, FileMaker.com has a couple of definitions that I'll just kind of read out loud to us here as well. I think they're helpful, and you can find these online as well. Context is the table, I dropped in the word occurrence here. Context is the table occurrence in the relationships graph from which a relationship is evaluated. If a table is the continent of Africa, your context is the table occurrence. That would be the country, right? It's sort of one within the other. And you can have multiple countries, multiple representations of what it means to be African. You got West African, you got North African. These are highly diversified. They can be different things, but they're still on the continent. I think that's a helpful analogy to keep in mind. So context, according to FileMaker, is the table occurrence in the relationships graph from which a relationship is evaluated. If you can picture your relationships graph as well, maybe you even got it open on your computer right now. If you just select one of those table occurrences, it'll turn blue, right? And kind of a second little informal analogy here for us today is that, which has been helpful to me, is like, all right, so at any one time, I'm a frog, and I am sitting on that lily pad of context. That's my table occurrence. I can only be sitting on one lily pad at a time, and I can only jump to connected lily pads. You can't kind of straddle two worlds of context. I think that's part of that definition. Oh no, here's the scary part of the definition over in their calculation explanation on FileMaker.com. Because each context choice represents a different association of related tables and fields, choosing the evaluation context for your calculation or layout or script or export is critical to getting the results you expect. So it's not just about what that table occurrence is, and it's how it's interconnected. It's the design behind those relationships and those table occurrences that's ultimately going to influence whether you are going to get the results that you expect from that script, from that layout, from that export. But here's the good news. It's really only two things, right? It's two settings, and they're super easy. And you all are going to grasp this and nail this if you haven't already. Hopefully we'll be able to help a bit today. And I've put those links into the PDF that you can download and click through. It's only a layout setting and a calculation setting. When you ultimately use context, those are your two spots where you're really going to choose it. It's a big kind of loaded word, so it might mean different things to different folks. But I think it's helpful also if I just kind of try to simplify some of the things and say, hey, there's two spots inside of FileMaker where you're going to pick it, and let me show you those two spots. And then, yeah, okay. It's really more largely any time that you're going to pick a table occurrence and just kind of getting into that difference of, all right, I'm picking a table occurrence, I'm not picking a table. I think that might be a helpful thing as well. That's going to influence go-to-related records. That's going to influence sorting by related fields, adding a sub-summary part to a report. There's going to be lots of different places where this is going to crop up, but two main places where you're going to pick it. So without further ado, when you're on a layout and you are first setting out that layout, or you go click the little pencil icon there, or you go into Manage Layouts and you open up the layout, you're going to get this little choice, and it's going to say, Show Records From, okay? And when you click right there inside of that image on the screen, you click School. Anyone, what are you going to see a list of? Are you going to see a list of tables or table occurrences? Table occurrences, that's exactly right. And it's going to be all table occurrences across your entire file. So if you have a massive solution, you know very well that organizing that list of table occurrences alphabetically, naming conventions, that thing can get long. So you want to just play to that in terms of kind of how you set up your naming convention. What is there and reflected on the screen is kind of a modified version of the anchor buoy method. We use a little capitalization to reinforce and kind of support the context in the relational model. But the benefit is, and I'll walk you through that and give you some demo solutions for it as well. The benefit is, of course, mainly that it's alphabetized, so you can use type ahead. So you can get very fast to develop simple solutions. In this thing that I've got there, it's course, district, school, teacher. It's a 4-table solution. I should only need 4 table occurrences. No, you can do it that way. Another way is that you might need 8 or more table occurrences as you go. So that's the first spot. The second spot is within calculations. At the very top of the specify calculation dialog box, you're going to see the exact same thing. It's going to say, evaluate this calculation from the context of, and when you click that picker again, it's going to be table occurrences, but it's not going to be the long laundry list. In this 4-table solution, there's only 3 table occurrences where I've actually referenced our school table. And because of our naming convention, from this context, I'm setting up a new calculation inside of the school table, so FileMaker's already smart enough to know, hey, I'm not going to show you every table occurrence. I'll just whittle down that list to only table occurrences that are connected to the root table, which is, in this case, is the school table. Everything that we're going to talk about today, I've worked really carefully to try to make sure it actually syncs up with a couple of different resources, in part because I didn't want to build out all the extra resources for you, because they're already built out and they're really well articulated online. And in part, I thought it'd actually present kind of a nice contrast. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop open the invoices starter solution, which I've given you in your download. And if anyone doesn't have that, you can go online there, or we've got a few flash drives around that folks are sending around. And you'll see example 1, which is just your invoices file. And I'm going to go ahead and flip over to that invoices file myself. And let's just start to get kind of a little bit handy with how you're going to choose context. So I'm going to hop over into FileMaker. When you first open this starter solution, you're going to come to what's called a dashboard, and dashboards have, by nature, very tricky context. A lot of times they're built from like a globals or a universal or a session table. Sometimes it only has 1 record in it, and that can be a whole different discussion. For now, let's go ahead and click New Invoice. There's a couple ways to get there. This is new customer. We're kind of inside of the context of an invoice, but they've done a really cool thing here through globals, where I'm able to just like quick add a company. So let's add the Gaylord Resort. Where are we? Grapevine. And that's my new customer. So we just participated in some context that was actually really complicated, because we were inside of the context of the invoices detail view. And so if you go into layout mode right now on this layout, you're going to see the little pencil icon. And sure enough, show records from is coming from the invoices table. We're sitting on a found set of just 1 record that has not much, if any, data in it at this point. And you've picked a company, but not only have you picked a company, you've created a new company. So there's a couple advanced things going on there. And if at some point it's helpful to kind of unpack that after this session, happy to walk through that. But ultimately, you've picked the company and you've created the company and then you've also picked the company. And then from there on in, it should feel like you're in a kind of a normal invoice context. And again, this is going to sync exactly up with a few references and links that I've given you inside of the PDF, where FileMaker help documentation is going to walk you through setting up relationships. It's always going to be about customers, invoices, invoice line items, products. Those are what a lot of those examples are, so it should sync up very nicely. Cleaning services. Let's say we've got a new invoice here. We've got one of those, and it's for the entire day, for the entire conference. So let's charge Gaylord that much. We've just created, let's see, trash collection. And that was 8 rooms at $450 a pop. So we've just created 2 new records into the invoice line item table from our base context of invoices. So lots of things going on here. Obviously, this is just a classic one-to-many. This is a portal. And if you flip into layout mode, you're going to see down here in light gray, this is where FileMaker is going to tell you sort of the context for how you're getting to that portal. One thing that we're going to see in this particular technique is that it's just a classic kind of, what do we call it, a spider graph here, where, hey, we want to build this as easy as possible, so we've got invoices, and sure, that can have a customer, but we also have like these customer picker popover things. And then we've got invoice data, and we're not going to, in this case, in this technique, which is a really easy and simple way to get started with FileMaker, we're not going to articulate this whole thing called the anchored buoy method. We're not going to type out, like, hey, how did we get to this table occurrence? We're just going to call it invoice data. And then there are trade-offs with kind of that technique. We'll continue to unpack that as we go. Invoice data can be related to products and so on and so forth. I'd like to draw your eye to one thing that I've been doing this for 17 years and that I noticed for the very first time yesterday as I was pulling together the slides. It was really fun, and I've talked with a few colleagues about it and said, like, hey, did you know about this? You may have seen these symbols for how entities relate. Let me just kind of clear this up a little bit. I typically kind of think a little bit left to right, and so I kind of want my stuff sort of flowing left to right a little bit as I kind of think through a data model. That may be different from you, and obviously FileMaker is going to give you a kind of a visual and graphical representation. But does anyone know, what drives the fact that this relationship right here? Let's see if I can remember how to kind of zoom in my screen here. Let's see, Control Option. There we go. What drives the fact that that invoice ID over to the invoice ID match field is showing as a single straight line instead of 3 pieces of data? Maybe I would just say, like, is it the data or is it the schema? Does anyone have a guess? Yeah, sir. It's whether it's unique or not. And do you mean that the data is unique? No. When you're defining the field definitions. All right, so let's go test that out. Anyone else have a guess of what drives that? It's a primary key. How does FileMaker know it's a primary key? Pardon? Good question. So it could be the UUID. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, sort of what he said, except that you can have a primary key that you call a primary key, but it shouldn't be a primary key because it's not unique.
Okay. So good questions. And I went through this exact same thing yesterday. I was like, what is driving that? And I tweaked it. I went all around and said, man, does it have to do with validation? Is it like, am I really validating that this thing is unique? And does it have to do with the auto enter options? Does it have to do with the data? So there's a little hidden thing here. I couldn't find anything online about it. We can go ask a FileMaker engineer after this. But there's a couple of auto enter options that FileMaker will recognize as sort of valid producers of a unique primary key. So you can have a database with 0 data in it. Doesn't matter at all. You have 0 records inside your invoice table, and FileMaker knows what it thinks about your relationship that you've set up. it's going to sort of cast judgment on that relationship, and it's going to say, you know what, that thing is a many-to-many. That thing is a many-to-one. And it's going to just give you a visual representation. One of the greatest things about FileMaker is that, of course, the flexibility. You can kind of do whatever you want with it. It doesn't what we call enforce referential integrity, which if you're coming from Access, you know you can't do whatever you want. It'll give you a big old juicy error if your kind of data model is not right. And that is a fantastic thing, and that's also part of the challenge of our kind of environment. Because sometimes you can sort of build some little outcomes that are not so desirable. So without further ado, someone mentioned UUID. So serial number, correct, that would work. You know, if you did a random string, does anyone guess, is that going to work? I mean, it should be unique. If you did a random number. All right, let's just go ahead and do it. Let's just submit that change. And we go over to the relationships graph. No, FileMaker does not think that's unique, because we can see we get this kind of three-line fork here. Does everyone see that? So the things that I found that it likes, someone mentioned get UUID. If you've never used those before, they're just big, long strings of text. In this case, this was set to serial number, and the next was going to be 4 on creation, which FileMaker also recognized. I flipped that back, and sure enough, there's my single line again. So you can, even right now, pop open some solution that you've been working on for, someone mentioned they were working on a solution for 20 years, right? You can pop open that solution, and you can kind of read through your relationships graph, again, with new eyes. And I would encourage you, just very simply, just to go through there and spot any times that you have what FileMaker is going to represent as a many-to-many. I guess it'd sort of be like this, right? It'd be a fork on one side and a fork on the other. And just kind of circle those and think, you know, do I have mastery over what that relationship means? You should totally use those. There's a certain time and a place for using them. We build massive solutions sometimes that have none of them, though, okay? Because primary keys and foreign keys is kind of like this sort of like real kind of robust, solid way to build out a data model. And multi-key matching, it's going to be a little bit more advanced. There's a right place and right time for it, to be sure. But just go around and look for kind of your many-to-manys and circle those and just kind of think about, you know, what that would look like to kind of bring those into what some might call like a normalized form. Great, so that's just a little primer. I'm going to just discard those results, and we're kind of done with that thus far. So with context, we see some kind of mysterious symptoms, and I feel like this is one of the hardest things about teaching context, is that you're going to see some things sometimes that happen inside of FileMaker, as we all do, that are not working quite right, and sometimes they're a little bit disconnected from the actual cause. And you're like a physician, and you hear something's going on with the lungs, but it's actually the real source of it is some other thing. So sometimes we see like, okay, I'm in this portal. I know that there's data in that target. Why is this data not showing up? This is one of my favorites here is, why does this work for one record but not another? I've created now 100 invoices. It was working. It was working last week. Did someone mess with my solution? Right, I can see some people, some nods out there. It was working before, but in this particular case, like the business rules shifted on me slightly. And so someone put in an invoice slightly different. I can't tell why it's throwing that result. I can't quite see why that calculation is evaluating that in that way, or that summary field. And then this is one of the hardest things to solve in FileMaker, is that worked. I got lucky, but I'm no smarter today than I was yesterday. I'm no more informed. Because again, that's one of the great things about FileMaker. It's one of the hard things about FileMaker. Sometimes it just works. That's what the whole kind of purpose of sort of low code, no community is. And as we're doing workplace innovation, we want things that are just going to work, right? And yet we also want to be able to scale onto those solutions and kind of step up our game, which is, of course, why everyone's here this week. I would also present a couple of sort of big, hairy challenges for us this session as well, which is a really tough thing. This isn't a complaint. There's nothing I could conceive of where you would change this, but it's really challenging, and it's a little bit weird that sometimes you're working on a layout, you're moving something around, you're looking at sample data, and then you say, like, okay, go into browse mode, and it's still not working. And the answer would only be solved if you were actually to go into database definitions, go into your relationships graph and make like a significant change that might impact all sorts of other things inside your file. So again, there's no solution there other than to say that, hey, this is a big challenge. It's a big challenge for everyone and across the entire community, is that I've got this symptom over here, and the solution was actually way over here, and I've got no visual. So part of what we're going to do today and what you'll see in the later solution files is that I've actually just tried to integrate those things. I've modified the existing starter solutions so that way you can pop open a big yellow button and say, like, what's going on with this feature? And you can kind of unpack that side by side. Also, these things can be a significant change later, effort to change these things later. And some of you have already spoken about this as we were chatting before the session. It's like, hey, I'm down this path. This organization has been using this file in this way for a long time. To rebuild that layout around kind of a normalized or an anchor buoy, that might be months of work. And so unfortunately, data modeling and contextual questions, stepping way back, and just to give you the full bad news here, is that invariably, the times in my career that I've read stories that are, wow, there's a significant challenge now going on to the health of this organization, to the life of this organization. Invariably, it feels like a lot of times it can come back to context and to data model. But I've got one key simple idea for you today. This will be kind of our biggest takeaway, and it's how to get like this unified theory, right, in one big sentence that I thought a lot about. And the unified theory is that context applies your data model. I know we're dealing with abstract stuff, and we'll get down to some of the tactical things, but I do think this is an important thing to just kind of bake in a bit, is that context, it's the application of your data model, right? If you study physics in college, you may become a physics professor. If you study applied physics, otherwise known as engineering, then you may go on to engineer solutions. You're going to apply those. Context is the application. The data model is sort of like the theory. That's you get your PhD in data modeling, you get your working man's PhD in context. But they're kind of connected through like a little river of flow, right? And I've sort of outlined 5 kind of major concepts that would be helpful to just kind of make sure that they're on the tip of your tongue here. First, and I know sometimes we actually go 5 to 1. I've done that many times myself. You have to sometimes start building before you can actually sort of reverse engineer the data model. So this is the idealized. This is sort of the theoretical ideal process. The very first thing is you're going to design your data model, and then you're going to build up your tables. From those, you're going to start popping them on the relationships graph, and those become table occurrences. You're going to start connecting them in relationships. And lastly, you're going to pick your table occurrences as your context for doing something, right? That's the last thing is going to be the application. The very first thing is the data model. So today, we've got 3 simple things that we're going to do. We're going to leave you with a couple of analogies, which I hope are going to last. I hope I see you here next year, and I hope you say, I still remember, it was goofy, but I still remember that lily pad analogy. It stuck with me, man. Got me through a hard time. We're going to ideally validate your data model. I mean, like for the existing solutions that you've been working on, I want to just give you a little toolkit for kind of evaluating that. And lastly, I want to help you kind of just apply that data model and see your solutions flourish going forward with just like a new level of consistency and professionalism that I know we're all here to achieve. Okay, 3 analogies. I guess the lily pad is sort of our bonus 4th, but this one's one of our favorites. And this one we kind of uncovered together when we were up in that coffee exporter, up in the hot back office room together with a group of first interns. This is our little Kiza USA office at my home garage. So this house analogy comes to me. If your house, some of you are building a warehouse, right? You're building a mansion. It's got tons of rooms. It's a big thing. Some of you, it's just it's kind of just got 2 or 3 floors. But either way, this analogy might be helpful. The house is the file, right? And some of you have multiple files because actually you're migrating from FileMaker 7, and you've still got kind of tons of different files spread out. But if we really think of kind of the house is the main file, it's the main database that you're working with, then the floor might be something like the table, We think about even the graphic on your, when we first checked in at registration, if you're staying at the hotel or whatever, they give you this big schema diagram and they kind of segment the floors out and with different colors and things. The floor is like a table. We think of our courses, teachers, schools, districts. Those are individual floors, but they get segmented into table occurrences. And then here's the fun part of this analogy. If you can picture that mansion with the spiraling staircase, and the grand staircase right in the entrance there, you're going to have multiple connections for kind of how your different floors of your house are going to connect together. I see some people nodding along to this one. That's awesome. And you kind of have to pick a room, right? You have to pick a room where that staircase, if you're the architect and you're drawing up those blueprints, you got to pick the room where the staircase is going to start. You got to pick the room where the staircase is going to end. And you kind of got to have a good plan, or otherwise you're going to end up with a little gap at the end, right? You want the whole house to have like kind of the right type of flow. And so that's kind of where the planning and the blueprinting part comes into play. But if you ever get stuck and you're just trying to grasp it, just go back to the house idea and say, like, all right, so I know that I'm on this table, I know that I'm on this floor, but I'm segmented over into this small, unique world, which is like a room. And I can connect out of that room only in certain ways. So that may help as you're trying to picture kind of expected results. Lastly, you're going to invite some guests to this party. This is the application moment. And your guests are going to say, great, where's the bathroom? You say, well, it's up the spiral staircase in the back. And then they come out of the bathroom and they may come down a different staircase. Idea here is that it's all one thing, but there's really kind of these like 5 levels of segmentation. It breaks down in some ways. It's not the perfect analogy, but hopefully it's helpful to you. Another one. This one's a faster and a simple one. Plato. You grab a lump of clay. It has a certain color. It has a certain texture. You're going to feed it through a mold, and you're going to sort of slide that little yellow thing there, and you're going to be choosing like, hey, how do I want my stuff to come out? And those choices are significant, and they influence the expected result. Does that one work for you? Yeah. And lastly, I would just say, choose your own adventure. Typically, it's some sort of like analogy from the physical world is helpful for me, but I know there's like kinesthetic learning. There's different things like, oh, I can visualize this. I could grab this. I could feel this. I could touch this. There's a little photo of Rwanda up in those mountains. That's where the last known mountain gorillas live on the face of the earth. And one of them goosed me. I think it must have been my raincoat, but I don't know. So think about an analogy that's going to be helpful for you that you can kind of carry on with you as you're working. For me, the analogy of the house is like pretty kind of fundamental as we're digging in. And like these things are like, they sort of sound simple, but as you're in the midst of developing like kind of a complicated script, you need to go to related records, and then you're going to export some data from that context, and then as you export, your customer is going to ask you for data from some other place. And so you're going to be picking context and picking the sort of the relationship flow over and over again. And I think it can be helpful to just kind of go back to that baseline analogy of, all right, in this room, and I need to get there, and then I need to be able to see into that other room, sort of through this window. I also was reading on some of the forums as people were kind of debating about this. Someone mentioned like a binoculars analogy. You've got certain lenses and certain focus, and you can kind of look through it one way or look through it the other way, and the expected results are going to be dramatically different. Now I'd like to walk you through 3 techniques. This is hopefully where we get a little bit more tangible, a little bit more tactical, and you're going to be able to take these techniques. I want to make them just kind of accessible and straightforward enough that you can take these techniques and just straight up apply them today to your existing solutions. It's participatory though, so without further ado, I'll walk you through an example of one-to-many, many-to-one, and how we can accomplish a many-to-many. Again, FileMaker help stuff, and here are the links that I've been referring to a couple of times. Planning databases.html and related tables files.html. They're all going to reference customers, invoices, line items, and products. And that's the exact same thing as the starter solution, and that's the exact same thing as the modified starter solution that I've given you. This is an invoice table occurrence. So this is a little bit goofy, but I'm going to go for it. I'm going to ask you to repeat after me, please. Everyone say, I am an invoice. I am an invoice. That's your context. That's your base table of context. That's your identity. Hold that close to your chest. If you're ever developing a layout that's based on the invoice table occurrence, hold on to this, right? This is your green card. This is your identification. This is your base table occurrence. For me, I like to use a lot of gestures. I like to even like grab a physical invoice. And you know, if I'm ever kind of getting to know a new organization, I say, okay, that's great. Can I see an example of that? Can you take me to the place in the warehouse where a person writes that down? I just want to see that physical world. And I think speaking it out loud, I am an invoice, is a great way to start. This is our technique for a classic one-to-many. I'll read number 1, and then I'll ask you to repeat after me number 2. So I am an invoice, and I want to see. I want to see. Good. So I'm an invoice and I want to see. Some might say like I want to get, or I'd like to receive, or I want to count up, or I want to sum. Get what works for you, or I want to go to. For me, I don't know what it says about me or something, but I want to see that, right? So I'm an invoice and I want to see, and you're going to speak out that expected result. This is the third one here. So I'm an invoice and I want to see a list of my one or many related, a list of my one or many related, and there's specific ways that I've tried to map out this grammar so that way it's actually, you know, explicit, right? This is almost like writing code, and I would just suggest, you know, give this a try and see if you can talk through your relationships graph. If you see that little one, you know, kind of one line up here on the top, and you see the many down there, you should be able to read this formula through, regardless of your naming convention. And lastly, speak out in plural the resultant target table. Sometimes our table occurrences are actually not named what the target table is. Quite often I see that, and it's confusing. If I come into some situation, I'm like, all right, so it's called, you know, receivables now, but no, it's actually pulling from the invoice table. So I am an invoice, and I want to see a list of my one or many related line items, right? So you have to like kind of fully put your, you know, your grammar, your sentence into reinforcing the data model is kind of the suggestion here. So let's pop open example 2, and this will show us exactly what I'm talking about. Example 2 here in the demo files that we handed out. I started to annotate this a little bit, and inside of this demo file, you'll see these 2 yellow popovers. And this is what I was speaking about kind of the idea of integration. I don't know if this is a groundbreaking idea here or something really cool, but you certainly can do this. You certainly can take an image from your relationships graph, and you can put it right into a layout, right? You can take that text that I'm just giving you, you can write that out. You could even hide that from your users. But as you're trying to especially build like a complicated many-to-many, that might be helpful for you to kind of see that. In this case, we're seeing a list of our one or many related invoice line items, and so I just want that reflected before things get a little bit more complicated. Okay, so I'll leave you with that starter solution, and then back to, there we go, good. Many-to-one relationships. We'll talk through this all 4 points at once. So now I'm kind of on the lower right side here, and my relationships graph may or may not be reinforcing, you know, visually, it may or may not be reinforcing my data model. In this case, we're actually going to read from the lower right up to the upper left. And we'll all do it together at once. Ready? I am an invoice, and I want to see information from my one and only one related customer. As you say that out and you sense check it, because now you're reading from the fork up to kind of the single line, as you sense check your own data model after this, you know, the point is, and the hope is that you're going to say something and you're going to say one and only one related, like that can't be possible. I've done something maybe that might not be exactly true. And hopefully speaking it will let you realize like, hey, something might be broken down here. Great, let's pop open, I think this is going to be, yeah, still invoices 2. And the show context button up on the upper left-hand side. You're seeing that customer that I built out already. And let's see here. show context is going to say, great, for the Gaylord Resort in Grapevine, Texas, I'm an invoice and I want to see information from my one and only related customer. Easy stuff, right? These are just fundamentals, and wanted to just take a little bit of time kind of laying that out. Lastly, we're getting on to a more complicated many-to-many relationship. I've seen many solutions that just kind of shortcut the join table. That little thing sitting in the middle there, that it helps establish your many-to-many in kind of a robust database-like way. There are ways that you can just totally bypass it. And FileMaker is great at helping you bypass it. And that may be appropriate. And then in 2 or 3 years, the business rules may evolve, the reporting needs may evolve, and you might need to say, well, yeah, but I need to know the guts of those transactions. Things like a date-to-date range search of how many times have I actually used that product? What's my average price when I use that product over the last 6 months? Those are like really specific granular questions that you're going to actually need to ask out of that line item table. That would be your context for answering and asking those questions out of the line item table. Another just big kind of generalization before we read this thing out is that in general, you want to build your data entry screens from the top of kind of your relationships graph. You want to build it from kind of the highest parts of your relationship graph, from the tables that have very few foreign keys, right? In this example, our invoice table does have a foreign key to a customer. Okay, so yeah, we're going to pick one of those. So it's maybe not the very highest, but it's that kind of meaty second tier. You've got a couple of nominal pickers. I'm going to pick the customer. I'm going to pick like, okay, the invoicing region or the sales rep that booked it. All right, those are like little nominal pickers, but the heart of my business is about processing invoices. And I'm going to look from the invoicing perspective down into the line items. And in general, as a vast generalization, if it's a helpful shortcut for you, you want to build your data entry screens from the kind of the higher parts of your data model. And you want to build your reports, by contrast, and your exports to get the full granular detail of what happened when and why and by whom from the very bottom parts of your data model. That would be also another just quick good one to just kind of write down and test that out relative to your data model. You know, the very sort of bottom part of kind of your entity relationship diagram, if you're familiar with an ERD, the very bottom is going to be fed into by a lot of forks in your design here. So in this case, the invoice line items are at the very bottom. All right, one more, group call and response. Let's read through this whole thing together. And again, there's really specific language that I tried to craft out here in sort of like a developer-y kind of explicit way that I think might be helpful for you. If you spot these one-to-manys, this is a way to sense check it after this session. All right, let's all begin together. I am an invoice, and for each of my one or many related line items, I want to see information from their one and only one related product. Again, I would encourage you for all those nouns in there, whether it's an invoice or a line item or a product, think about your, whether it's plural or singular, and then think about, instead of speaking the table occurrence, think about always speaking the table name, because I think that's going to be helpful to you. If you can get back to kind of where you were with the spreadsheet, like, all right, so that's an invoice, that's a line item, I can picture those things. And then as you're passing through the join, one of the things that you want to be sure to kind of test yourself of is, have I spoken through the actual relationships that I'm using? Or did I try to kind of do this after the fact pitfall thing where I say like, I'm an invoice and I just want to see my products. Whoops, that happened to be related to a line item. If you skip over kind of the lily pad, then you fall in the pond. So that can be a helpful thing for these many-to-manys, as you can visualize those and think of those. Pop open invoices 3 now, if you would. Just right on time, we've got a few minutes left. Pop open invoices 3, and you should be able to drill into that one simple invoice here. And I've built out a brand new tab just to kind of express this and get a little bit deeper here. So you'll see this products used and stock levels. So let's say you're processing these invoices over and over again, and you don't want to kind of jump over to the product world. This isn't quite exactly it, because for any one invoice, you'll see the stock levels currently. So you're actually just referencing live data inside of the product table. If you're building out these invoice line items and you've kind of done some coffee and tea service and you've picked a product here now, a cleaning solution and trash bags, you've set those up inside of your product table, and I'll let y'all kind of unpack this after the session. Then you may want to be able to see a tab that pulls out that classic many-to-many, which I've articulated in this new yellow button in solution 3. It spells out exactly the sentence that we've looked at. So this is probably kind of the one screen that might be helpful to just sort of chew on a little bit after the session and say, all right, I want to make sure that I totally grasp that. Yeah, one-to-many, I get it. Many-to-one, I totally get it. All right, but let me get into the mindset and into the mental slot of what a truly a many-to-many is going to look like and it's going to feel like. If you go into the layout mode here, you're going to see that this table occurrence is called product in example 3. The reason is because I've moved these things around in example 3, but I haven't changed anything over to the anchor buoy method. Still, we're going from an invoice. I've started to use some singular nouns because I like those. I've arranged it a little bit different. I've started to kind of represent, okay, this thing's a little higher because it's sort of a 1 and it's going down to a many. But still, when I look at this here, I'm going to discard those. When I look at this portal, I know nothing, and I've not reinforced at all my context. I could very easily be working in this portal and have lost my identity. I am an invoice. I am an invoice. And so what I've done in kind of this last solution, which we'll get to in a second here, building out these anchor buoy, is that I've tried to reinforce this thing, and you can go check it out after the session. I've tried to reinforce this anchor buoy method and build out alphabetized table occurrence groups. So that's another good term you can go grab there. That comes, I think, from lots of folks over several years. This isn't nothing new, nothing rocket science here. What we do is we alphabetize the table occurrence groups, and we make sure that we keep all the lines visible. And what that does is gives you type ahead, and not only type ahead inside of the relationships graph, but also type ahead inside of your calculation engine. So the ending result would look like on that very portal that I just showed you, oh, okay, I get it. I'm looking at an invoice, and for each of my one or many related line items, I want to see information for my one and only one related product. And I just want to reinforce that context with my naming conventions. Then when I'm seeing a portal on a layout, I can kind of reverse engineer that and unpack that. Let's pop open Invoices 4. And what you'll see here is a little example of kind of some of the payoff that you'll get if you employ the anchor buoy method, which has its trade-offs. But let's pop open example 4. And right away, you'll see inside of the relationships graph, whoa, this thing is big. It's just a little 4 or 5 table solution. Why does it have to be so big? So those are some of the examples of the trade-offs right there, right? As you're going, though, and if you've alphabetized it, you're going to get some nice type ahead. And then if you're inside of a calculation definition, say here I'm looking at the total subtotal, you're going to get some nice type ahead from this perspective as well. Okay, so I've left that table for you. What you'll see right away is that I did not go through and kind of normalize all of these layouts. So this is a sort of an example of a broken layout. This is some fallout, which I wanted to demonstrate, right? No, we don't want to show it from the invoice customer perspective. This is the customer detail view. So there's some fallout of migrating, which just suggests we want to be thinking about these things right up front, if possible, as you're building out your new solutions. Ultimately, those naming conventions are going to help with standardization, maintainability, sort of being a good peer if you've got other developers that you're working with. Your customers, your peers, your clients, they're going to see also these naming conventions as they're trying to export data, right? There's moments where your customers inside of FileMaker, your power users, are going to interact directly with your naming conventions. We'll have a few moments for some questions here, but I would just leave you with a couple of thoughts. It's critical that you get context right just because it gets baked in, right? after the fact, it can get a little hard to kind of overhaul a solution and kind of change its method. The big idea for the day was that context applies your data model. It's the application of it. It's when you invite the guests. Drawing analogies from the physical world has been helpful for me. You'll see this little speak your context technique and just sub in your own tables, right? And you could even make a little FileMaker database to kind of just sub in your own tables and speak those things aloud. Consider the anchor buoy method in the naming conventions. We do a little case-sensitive thing there as well, where if we're going down the tree, then we put it in lowercase. It's just to reinforce and make sure that we're always, our context is solidified. And of course, lastly, phone a friend. It can be literally really helpful to just speak these things aloud. And if you're, kind of a lone developer, especially, in-house without kind of whatever, be sure to kind of run some of this stuff by a friend, because it can be really helpful to have a teammate. How many folks use the anchor buoy method right now? Okay, so it's maybe about a 50-50. It's been hotly debated. You can go online and see people are talking about the trade-offs and performance trade-offs. Obviously, the graph that I built out was much bigger, sort of much more complicated up front. And FileMaker's supposed to be easy, right? And yet there's some kind of payoffs downstream. I appreciate it a lot. Thanks for coming.